Hello, dear friends. We're sincerely happy to greet you again. Today we will have a conversation with the esteemed Igor Mikhailovich Danilov.
Greetings.
Igor Mikhailovich, our viewers share that with every new video, they become more and more free. And thanks to your words, everyone finds those reference points for themselves, which enable them to correct their route to the goal and to continue moving already along a safer path, the path which is full of love. As you said in one of the videos, when one walks along with the Holy Spirit, any road and any path is the most pleasant walk with the being that loves you the most in the world. A great many people feel and understand this in practice, that any worries of everyday life no longer burden a person at such moments, that he already becomes completely different. But certainly at such moments, when a person actually moves and advances along the spiritual path, Shaitan doesn't sleep either. He tries in every possible way to lead the person astray from this path, and his tricks change. The style of his attacks changes. In one of the videos, you said that there are already fewer of such power impulses coming from the system, and more danger in the form of temptations awaits a person. A lot of people also understand this in practice. They say we face the fact that it's already easier to escape from coarse attacks of the system, from its intrusive thoughts, from despondency and fear. But it is very difficult to distinguish and refuse pleasant moments coming from the system, those cares from the system. Also, our friends, our viewers have noted such a moment after which they often stumble. It is when after spiritual practices, after deep emotions and deep states, they feel that in parallel with the deep flow of deep inner feelings, there is also some kind of euphoria, joy and ardor, but sort of a little bit doubtful ardor. Thoughts come that you can do everything, you are capable of anything, you are so good. Thus, people loosen this very control over the system, and at some moment they discover that instead of this sublime, elevated flight, they already feel that the spiritual height has been lowered. And the point certainly arises, what kind of a God on the spiritual path is that? What kind of joy is it? Is it consciousness rejoicing? And what does it rejoice at? Does it really rejoice at personality's success? Or does it receive some dividends from personality? We would like to understand
The mechanism itself.
this mechanism, yes, how it all works and functions in general.
Generally, everything is simple, friends. Let's sort this out. What happens at the moment of performing spiritual practice by a person? Is it beneficial to consciousness or not? Let's start with something simple and go down to the subjective perceptions that come to a person after proper performance of a spiritual practice, right? So, is it beneficial to consciousness that people perform spiritual practices? On the one hand, if we look at this, a person gets away from consciousness. He goes deeper, let's say, into the spiritual. Naturally, consciousness loses its power. But if a person does the practice correctly, if he already has experience, I'll repeat, if he has the experience of exactly spiritual contact, if there is an exchange of these powers, of what we call love or alat powers, then at this time, naturally, if the person does the practice correctly with a deep immersion, there occurs, I would put it so, overfilling of the environment around this person with pure energy, that very alat, or simply speaking, God's love, right? That is, such grace comes. This has been noted. Let's recall from works or even from historical facts when a person is spiritually developed, or as they used to say, a saint, then everything around him is full of bliss. So it is simply pleasant to be near such a person and you do not want to leave. Why? Because of the alat powers. It is certainly the supreme power, or to put it simply, it is what everything consists of. When a person immerses into this practice, there become more of these powers. And naturally, it also benefits the demon, the one we call consciousness. Why? He receives this and then he will sit quietly and calmly and be glad about what he receives. It is sort of compensation, let's say. to consciousness for subduing it? Well, in such a way, we have already analyzed one point, right? The second point, why does euphoria arise in a person? What is it? Is it consciousness that rejoices? Is it because it has eaten a lot, or what is going on? And here the answer is very simple and quite unexpected. It's a normal physiological reaction of our body. Why? Because when a person comes out of a properly performed spiritual practice, when there is already a real energy exchange, let me repeat, friends, so that there is understanding, because many people may look for this at the initial, let's say, steps towards spirituality during initial practices, or when they even try to perform them, saying, why does this not come, and why do I not have this? That's why we say that it's when a person has experience, when there is already a real energy exchange with the spiritual world. That is, when a person already accumulates this love, passes it continuously and receives it in return. And during such an energy exchange, our body interprets it all as a serious injury. Why? Because consciousness gets detached, and the work of neurons in the brain is disturbed. By the way, this can be even seen if you take an electroencephalogram. This is reflected, you can see when a person is in the state of deep immersion. You can also see how a spike takes place afterwards. It is absolutely similar and identical to an injection of opiates. However, in this case, endogenous opiates are produced as a protective reaction to this very outburst. That's why a person coming out of the practice is in a spiritualized state as personality, but when consciousness connects and a person sort of returns to a natural state, he is as if slightly under the influence of endogenous opiates. Hence, there is such a mood, and, as you said, a little bit elevated one, so to say.
Perky.
Yes, perky. But just note, exactly the same phenomenon is observed when a person gets into the clutches of an incubus or a succubus, let's say. It's the same there. But in that case, a lot of energy is taken away from a person, and the reaction is similar. That is, the body begins to react to this trauma, it interprets it as a great trauma, as a loss. Because no matter how we twist it, friends, but the energy component is primary anyway. And then blood, and all the rest already come, meaning the physiological component. And that's where our body's response to trauma is to anesthetize. In other words, it releases those opiates, and after communicating, let's say, in quotes, with that very incubus or succubus, depending on who that is, the person stays in euphoria and in a very elevated state for some time, but inside he's empty. Just note this point. There is euphoria as if after taking drugs it is something like, I would do everything and move everything, but after a while a very severe emptiness comes, down to deep depressive states, and the body becomes exhausted, but the person wants to bring this very state back. And people themselves start seeking such meetings, and they are ready to meet in order to bring such a state back again. It's like a drug addiction. This already turns out to be an addiction. Naturally, if a person opens up before third forces, they definitely come. They come, take even more. The person has euphoria again, and this can go on up to the point of death, so to speak. Sometimes people become so depleted through, let's say, being devoured by third forces that they simply die. It's a frequent phenomenon. What's also a frequent case is that a person enters a depressive state, he has little energy, he has nothing to feed them with, no one comes to him, the depression grows, and he just commits suicide. However, when one is in spiritual practice, the effect is the same. I mean the release of opiates, but in this case it happens due to overfilling. I'll try to explain it more correctly. Due to overfilling exactly with the allat powers, while they don't really coexist well with matter. So when a person is overfilled with them, consciousness certainly breaks the connection. And then the body, due to this very disconnection also. Why? Because when there's a lot of alat, yes, the system eats. It's clear that consciousness benefits from that. But it starts to move away. And in the structure, if we speak in the terms of visualizing a person's energy structure, there will be a shift in the field structure of our consciousness there. Why? It tries to move farther away because for consciousness it is both too tasty and at the same time destructive. Alat is burning it. I'll put it carefully. But at the same time it is nutritious. So this process is already perceived by our consciousness and our neurons also as a trauma. Thus the body starts to produce these opiates again. So when a person comes out of the practice, he feels not only spiritual replenishment, this elevation and flight, but an elated mood as well, owing to this endogenous release. But here it is very important that there's inner replenishment and an external good mood, sort of ardor, so to say. And when the chemicals quit working, the hormones abate, and the person remains in such a spiritual, elevated state, but without such inebriation, let's say.
Without striking chemical effects.
Right, without striking chemical effects. Well, I did my best to explain.
Great. Then one at least understands that at those moments one needs to delve even more into this wave of the deepest feelings.
Definitely, for sure. Why? Because there is another little aspect here. If a person is unstable on the spiritual path, if he is a little bit weak, let's say, even though he already performs real practice, but a human remains a human and he is susceptible to temptations up to the last moment anyway, this should also be understood. Then, of course, after coming out of the practice, when consciousness has switched on, despite the fact that it is overfilled with, let's say, static energy, meaning what is already flowing outwards, consciousness still remains an insatiable animal. Why? Because our consciousness is a part of the whole system, or to put it simply, our demon is merely a unit out of the whole legion of Satans, and no matter how much you give them, they always want more. That's why the demon is interested to tempt, to attack, and when the person is a little bit relaxed, under the influence of those chemicals, he may take a wrong step, which is exactly what this demon wants, in fact. Here you should also be attentive and not be distracted by the things you don't need, and certainly pay attention to what comes from the demon, what ideas he gives you. Right?
Right. Thank you very much. Here's another question, Igor Mikhailovich, from those who have just embarked on the spiritual path. People share that for a long time they haven't experienced the feeling of sincere joy and some kind of delight they had, for example, in childhood. And they say, I sit down to do a spiritual practice, I feel that I'm real here and now, I feel freedom. But sometimes, instead of joy, the prevailing sense is the one of sadness. What can we recommend to people in such a case? Can a person actually experience a sense of sadness in spiritual practice? For example, personality is in love, while consciousness is in sadness. Are such options possible or not? Or is it actually…
Of course they are possible. Yes, they are possible. When your demon performs the practice instead of you. My friends, you shouldn't perform spiritual practice through your consciousness. You know, this will not be even autogenic training, but a fake that the imp foists on you. Just have a look. Are you performing it as personality or not? Well, do you know when such a thing happens? I'll put it this way, friends, I'm sorry. We must speak the truth and call things by their proper names. When a person has no experience whatsoever, that is, he hasn't really worked on himself, but he decided to do so. He thinks, why should I start with the bare basics? Like everyone else, I sit down and perform spiritual practice right away. I've read, watched, and listened. Then what? Where's the experience? Well, experience will be gained over the years. It will be gained. I don't even argue. but you'll waste a lot of time, friends. Perhaps, for starters, you should begin with, let's say, simple things. In order to make it clear, you should realize, let's say, that you are personality, that there is primary consciousness, there is secondary consciousness. I mean, maybe it's better to start with simple things than autogenic training, as it is supposed to be, in order to separate secondary consciousness from primary one, to learn to control this. Then a position of an observer from primary consciousness over secondary one, and then, let's say the position of an observer as personality over consciousness. Afterwards, there are meditative practices. Well, all this is grounded and necessary. Whereas when you have mastered all this, precisely then, my friend, you can start performing spiritual practices as well. Then you won't have sadness from consciousness, because consciousness cannot perform spiritual practice. Well, these are incompatible things. We've just mentioned that when a person becomes overfilled with Allat as a personality, and actually a mini drop of Allat comes into this world, then the air becomes so thick, you sense it. Like butter, as people say, you can cut it with a knife. You know, there is such an expression. Those who experience that, they do know. Indeed, this is what causes panic in consciousness. It just becomes silent. Meanwhile, when we feel sad, these are games of consciousness at the first steps. When we are in a hurry, you know, we are all maximalists. And if we dive, we should dive headlong. I understand everything, friends, but games on the spiritual path either slow you down or Shaitan starts controlling you. And instead of you, let's put it so, telling where you should go and what is the right way to do something, it's not right, friends. You should have a serious and mature approach to spiritual practices. You should be prepared for them, and even if you are very talented, stages are needed anyway. You will simply pass through them quicker if you are very talented. The effect will be better and you will really learn something. You won't spend your whole life looking for yourself. Everything is very simple. That's why people sometimes have these states when they cannot separate and realize where they are and who they are. When they perform spiritual practice through consciousness, of course, I don't argue. Consciousness is capable of creating any model of illusion in us, but it's different. Why? Because if it is consciousness that does it, there will certainly be sadness, thoughts, and foolishness, whereas when you perform the practice as personality, everything is blissful. This cannot be confused with anything else. These are special states of being overfilled with God's love. This is unity, this is joy, this is life, this is everything, friends. This is all-encompassing happiness. Well, you cannot confuse it with anything or go wrong. Even a slight touch when it is particularly interesting when people start performing practices in the beginning, yes. It doesn't matter, even when you've passed all stages, both autogenic training and meditation, you already clearly identify yourself as personality, but you start taking the first little steps, and consciousness still creeps in, the demon still tries to control, and at some beautiful moment you start feeling that, yes, love is generated, you already see that it really works, and the first response is, I don't know, people say first love. This cannot be compared to it. This is, you know, I would compare it with the first time a person opens his eyes. It's a joy that is so all-encompassing, but many people confuse this with enlightenment and become frightened by this state, when a person has only begun to enter the practice and it seems to him that he sends this eternal message while in return it seems to be good but nothing comes back. Whereas here it's like a tsunami that overwhelms you and everything changes, there is no body, there is nothing, the world has changed, there is sheer love, joy, you experience the feeling of a flight. Certainly this all lasts for an instant, but it feels like an eternity. And a person who is not used to it naturally breaks the first such moment. And that's where the interesting thing begins. Consciousness immediately turns on and says, that's it, you're Bodhisattva. You've just had an epiphany. enlightenment has come down on you. It is said everywhere that this epiphany, this enlightenment, is a one-time outburst. You have actually experienced it just now. The Kundalini serpent has risen there, right? Or something else, the entire East and West, and all religions mixed up in his head. And that's it. The second time it doesn't happen anymore. If the person has fallen for the thoughts from Shaitan and exalted himself in pridefulness, but it's interesting, why doesn't it happen the second time? After all, so many people have encountered that. Why is there no this tsunami? Why is there no such love? Why? Because next time, instead of you, my friend, consciousness goes into spiritual practice. Why? I'll give you the following answer. Sometimes kids fool around. In the past, it was more frequent. There were such square batteries, and a lot of kids put them on their tongues, right? Then they grew up a little bit and started fooling around. There are such capacitors, they're charged with batteries. When you touch them, they give you an electric shock. Let me put it this way, once you get an electric shock, the second time you don't want that, right? Likewise with consciousness, after receiving an initial burn from God's love, a demon has felt the entire pleasure of hell here in his home, for it is his home in fact. And a second time he doesn't want to be roasted alive. So he takes over the reins. This is where we are faced with a serious stage, where you should really overcome it and restore this connection. Then, the second time there will be no such effect. The second time, everything starts smoothly, beautifully and nicely. While the first time, well, not for everyone, friends. Do not expect to also have a tsunami. Do not use this as a reference. Yes, it happens. Very, very often, I would say for the prevailing majority. But quite often, if a person performs everything correctly and advances without haste, this starts with a slight breeze, I would put it this way. Gradually, it increases, and this communication becomes more productive. And you don't even notice that, then consciousness behaves differently too. If there is no such sudden enlightenment, then it's much easier to tame it. It is calmer. It doesn't have stress or trauma afterwards. And somehow you don't need to recover and spend time on this later. Well, friends, you should understand it all. Therefore, when, let's say, you face such manifestations for the first time, be it a light breeze or a real, all-encompassing tsunami, well, still, whether it's one way or the other, consciousness begins to interfere, because even a light breeze, for it, is like a red-hot iron. So, you have to understand that consciousness will perceive it extremely negatively and will try to take leadership over you. So here it's important to stay, simply to stay in the position of personality, in the position of striving for the spiritual world, not to be frightened and not to be tempted, and most importantly, not to exalt oneself. Because the first thing consciousness begins to play on is pridefulness, to exalt a person and praise him. But we actually know that when the devil praises you, it means that you are doomed. So you must do something different, right?
And there is another...
I hope I've answered the question.
Yes, of course, very extensively. Most importantly, one understands even more answers at some in-depth level.
Well, this is a general answer.
When the voice of the deepest feelings sounds. Igor Mikhailovich, people ask another question. What if they have identified in themselves someone who leads them astray from the spiritual path? If they have identified this selfish primary consciousness that has grown up really big, how to make it stop? Perhaps one should intensify some intellectual activity, strengthen secondary consciousness, or when you actually develop as personality, everything falls into place and priorities become set correctly.
And here you've just answered the key question. If you develop as personality, naturally, everything will fall into place. But, again, we proceed from what? From time saving and efficiency, right? It's like in sports, I don't know, like in any art. For example, if you want to build a house with your own hands, what do you need? To go and learn. You can watch, let's say, on YouTube how people lay bricks, but it is better to go to a bricklayer. Stand around, watch, help him and try to work a little bit. Then you will master this skill faster, right? It's the same in this case. You still have to learn, right? That's all. I would say everything begins with simple, elementary things. Sometimes people waste years. Shaitan just leads them around, you know. A person has ardor, desire, and inner understanding. But Shaitan is strong too. He deludes people, and instead of spiritual practices, they simply fall asleep, rest, do devil knows what, and so on. Devil knows what in the literal sense of the word. Why? Because a person sits down to do a spiritual practice and concerts from Satan himself begin in his head. You know, this kind of thing.
The activity of secondary consciousness.
Yes, AC/DC hard rock is playing in his head. Is that really practice, my friends? Why? Because those points have been missed, you see?
That very autogenic training, right? To switch to primary consciousness.
Right. I'm so cool. Why would I do autogenic training? What do I need it for? At the very least, let's start with meditation, right?
Yes, exactly.
Meanwhile, autogenic training is a very important stage. Nowadays, after Schultz collected Oriental practices that had been created over millennia, removed philosophy from there and left only the functional part as he believed, it became sort of a simple tool, right? Without philosophy, without anything, but in actual fact, let's put it this way, autogenic training are the most ancient practices that were aimed at learning to control one's body by means of one's consciousness. In other words, it's the initial experience. That's exactly where an understanding is formed, that you are personality and that there is primary consciousness, and you as personality learn to control primary consciousness that controls the body. There's no place for secondary consciousness here. This is an important point.
That's right.
Because, you see, secondary consciousness is our professor in our head, so to say, an advisor, and the very smartest, I don't know what else to call it, a genie, let's put it so, who lives instead of us at times. Or let's say, sometimes we break away from its clutches. That would be more correct to say. So autogenic training is the first step. Even if you believe that you are very cool, almost a bodhisattva, but nothing works out for you in fact, my friend. This is life. You have to fight for it, and it is never shameful to go back to the beginning. It's better than going nowhere, right? Therefore, you should make autogenic training a part of your daily routine. You should spend a little time.
Then primary consciousness will already be more on the side of personality.
Absolutely right. First, you pay a lot of attention to it. You study how it works and draw it to your side. So primary consciousness will already support you and not secondary consciousness because it receives much more from you. That's the first stage. Secondly, you will learn to tame it. You will begin to understand how it works. When pridefulness boils up in it or something else, after all, the entire human stupidity originates mainly from primary consciousness. I mean, it's a little resentful child, a proudling, a narcissist, and everything else. That which actually turns our life into a shadow, into an illusion of our existence. It is what forces us to make mistakes, to go the wrong way, and to spend our entire lives chasing after things we don't need at all. This is true, friends. But after studying how it works, you can already proceed to another stage, when primary consciousness is already on your side. That's when, with its help, you begin to study how secondary consciousness works. This is nothing else but meditative practices. Plus, you learn how your body works, but already at another energy level. And that's where secondary consciousness certainly helps you. Besides, there are, let's say, other deeper practices that enable you to understand what secondary consciousness is, what its real capabilities are, and many other things. And then there is already the third stage, because while you As personality, we're training primary consciousness and studying secondary consciousness. You already became stronger as personality, my friend. And at this very point, understanding and knowing perfectly well how those consciousnesses work, you begin to work, you begin to mature, you start taking real first steps on the spiritual path, that is performance of spiritual practices. And this already becomes much more interesting, right? The main problem is actually, I'll put it as follows, friends. On the spiritual path, the main problem is the devil. You should not forget this. Do you know what the trouble is? The trouble is that we do not associate the devil, shaitan, and all that with our consciousness, because it was imposed on us from all sides for many, many years. Let's say, both on us and on our ancestors, that the devil is something material, and he is beyond, at least beyond our body. He is supposed to come somewhere from the outside. He is supposed to come as some material object or something else. As for the fact that he is in us, that we are both an angel and a demon in one person, we simply do not notice that. So the main point is to choose who you are, whether you are an angel or you are the devil. Well, not the devil, in fact, but a little imp. Otherwise, you know, pridefulness immediately arises. Yes, I'm the devil. That's exactly the way he works. He overestimates everything unnecessary and small, and underestimates everything big and important. Therefore, the main thing is not to give up. The main thing is to be vigilant on the spiritual path and to accumulate the Holy Spirit, and everything will work out, right? Thank you for being with us, friends.
Thank you very much, Igor Mikhailovich.
Thank you. Friends, let's just love each other. Peace be with you.